I'm very thankful to Face Foundation for asking me to speak in this series called Hyderabad, the City of Many Stories. I think it's a great initiative. So, to begin to talk about water bodies in Hyderabad, lakes, as we keep calling them, maybe the best way to start it would be to look at the names that we have for these water bodies. Mantrala Cheruvu, Barlakunta, Kamanikunta, Tedla Cheruvu, Hamid Khan Kunta, Shukur Sagar, Fox Sagar. What are all these different names? What do they mean? And very often you actually don't have lake in the name. What you have is something like Cheruvu, Talab, Kunta. Sometimes they're called tanks and so on and so forth. Lake is actually a word that comes into usage only in the last 20 or 30 years, not more than that. So if we think about what this notion of a water body, which is called Cheruvu or Kunta or Talab or tank might be, and how it transforms into something called lake in Hyderabad, maybe one of the places where we can start doing this is to think about the area that we are looking at. The area of Hyderabad city, depending on how what you consider as the boundary of the city. Are we thinking about the municipal corporation? Are we thinking about the extended urban built-up area? Are we thinking about the eventually urbanizable land? Each of these things has very different areas. So if you take, for example, the Hyderabad Metropolitan Development Authority's area, that is about 7,000 square kilometers, and that's bigger than Goa State. If you take the built-up area of Hyderabad city as it stands now, that would be easily about 12 to 1300 square kilometers. Maybe if you consider the thinner fragmented edges, it will be even 1800 square kilometers. But if you take only the municipal area of Hyderabad Municipal Corporation, that would be about 600 square kilometers. And if we take only the Hyderabad district, which is the revenue area, that would be even lesser than that, maybe 150 square kilometers or something like that. Now, in this area, if we take the HMDA's larger area, there would be about 3,500 to 4,000 tanks. If you take the extended urban area, it could be about 500 tanks, and within the city there would be about 150 or so within the smaller area of the municipal corporation or even the district. Now, where and when have these tanks actually come from? What is their history? How old are they? If we start digging into that history, we'll find something very interesting. Most of these names, if you see, have to do with people who lived by the lakes, or they have to do with the ways in which we used the water from these tanks, which means that they are actually created by people. If not actually constructed, they may have been tampered with or moderated in some way, reorganized in some way. They've been engineered by people. This engineering of water, that by harvesting it, by accumulating it, releasing it in a controlled manner, all of this is not older than a maximum of about 1,000 years. Within southern India, the oldest known irrigation related engineering was the Kaveri river um, dam, Anicut. And then in the Telangana region, it would be about the 12th century or so, the Bhadrakali temple and so on in what is now the Warangal region. In the Hyderabad region, it would be about 400 to 500 years old, not longer than that. The biggest tank that we have in Hyderabad city, Hussain Sagar, is 400 years old. If you look at the Miralam tanks, it's even smaller, maybe 150 to 200 years old. And then you have the Gandipet two large lakes, which are less than 100 years old. So, what is the geological background of all of this? That is actually a much longer story. The geology of Hyderabad region, which is called the Deccan Plateau, is actually formed about 65 million years ago, and that is older than the Himalayan mountain range by at least 10 million years. Out of that long historical stretch where the land was slowly, gradually shaped by wind, by rain, by sleet over millions and millions of years, you have a tiny stretch of it which becomes available to you for agriculture, which is then further, in some minute way, engineered by human beings for use for actual agricultural productive work. And this is the important thing. All of our tanks, the things that we keep calling the cherus, the kuntas, talabs, and so on, are actually engineering infrastructures that were created for some kind of a purpose to serve for human habitations. So you have tanks that are meant for irrigation. You have tanks that are meant for drinking water. You have edges of the tank which is used by washermen, which is used by potters. You have fishermen using the water. So in many ways, you can't remove these tanks. You can't isolate these tanks from the agrarian economy in which they were actually created as engineering infrastructures. They were not just created as engineering infrastructures and left alone, they were actually then imbued with a set of spiritual values and a set of spiritual symbolism. So every tank would have something called the Kattamaisama temple on top of it. So if you think about the engineering of any tank, what you have is a bund, which is an anicut kind of thing, which holds the water from leaving the area. So it's basically in a valley. What you do is to build a wall so that the water is held back, and then to release that water in a regulated manner, in that bund you build doors, locks, and those locks, there are three types of them. There's one larger sluice which releases the water for agriculture. Then you have a smaller sluice which also releases water for some of the agricultural work. And then you have what is called a surplus wear. Surplus wear is that engineering feature which basically takes care of all the surplus water that is coming into the tank. So when you have excess rain, excess water coming in, the water will flow over that surplus wear. Now, once you reach that surplus wear level height, that is when you say that the tank has reached full tank level. Because what you're doing is to build this engineering structure in such a way that the water will not flow over the bund, it will be held in a reasonable quantity, and anything extra will be released through surplus wear. Therefore, when the water reaches the surplus wear level, we have a full tank level. The extent to which this water spreads behind that wall is what is called the full tank level on and the full tank level is basically found where you have the foreshore. That is, in the foreshore, water extends beyond the full tank level when you have a lot of water. Water then recedes behind the full tank level when the water has been emptied through the main sluices. Now, this structure is meant to be a very, very finely balanced engineering structure, and things can still go wrong. So you have a goddess which is who's sitting on the bund, which is called the Katta in Telugu, and Katta Maisamma is the goddess who sits there and oversees this whole process year after year. You also have in many places Sufi pairs, graves, which are the dargahs, and many of the tanks are also named after them. And it's these two spiritual elements, that is the Kattamaisama and the Sufi pair, who look after the well-being of the people all around these water tanks. Now, this structure is the one which has been very gradually absorbed into the urban context of Hyderabad city, and this is where our trouble begins. What happens is, in 1908, we have the first major flood. It's not that we haven't had floods in the city before that, but The first major flood that really catches everybody's attention happens in 1908 on September 28th, when literally hundreds of people died. There's a tree in the Musi River, it's a tamarind tree which is right opposite the Usmania Hospital. That tree is supposed to have saved a lot of lives. So people still go there even now. The tree is still alive. People go there even now to offer their worship every year on that September 28th. This flood moved the state to such an extent that they felt prompted to commission a very important engineer of that time by name Mokshagundam Visvesvaraya. Mokshagundam Visvesvaraya at that point of time, sometime in the summer of 1909, was actually thinking of retiring from his work, and he was traveling in Italy. He is contacted and asked to come to Hyderabad and offer two engineering plans. One plan has to do with constructing a flood control mechanism, which is the two reservoirs, that is the Gandipet reservoir, Susman Sagar and Himayat Sagar. And the second thing is to provide a drainage plan for the city, just in case you have rain in the city, excess rain, what do you do? How do you take out the drainage water from all the houses and so on and so forth? The plans that Mokshagundam Visvesvaraya offers at that time are described in great detail in a lot of his own writing and also in the engineering documents of that time. What he says is that the Musi catchment basin is about 800 square miles, and within that 800 square miles, you have, for every square mile, you have one tank, right? And that one tank is connected to a number of tanks. So basically, Hyderabad city is about 600 meters above mean sea level, and from there you have several contours, that is lower levels on the gradient, and water is first held at the highest level. From there, it keeps cascading down into tanks at the lower levels through water called nalas. And when you have excess water coming into the top level tanks, that tank breaches, and then that brings in a tremendous amount of water into the next tank at a very rapid pace, which breaches the second one also. So the flood in 1908, according to Visvesvaraya, was caused by so many tanks breaching at the same time. And therefore, the task is to figure out some way of making sure that water does not drain off so rapidly, even under conditions of cloudburst and excessive rain. This is where the actual work of Hyderabad city begins to get very, very complicated. By 1970s, that's about 56 years after 50, 60 years after the two tanks were built, and the drainage system for Hyderabad city was created, we have a lot of new construction in the city, and that new construction in the city begins to release excess water into the nalas. That is, all of the used water, the grey water and the black water from homes, is also released into the nalas, and it has no place to go to, and therefore it goes into our tanks. And in those tanks now you have sewage saturated water, which cannot actually sustain any of life. And because agriculture has been stopped in in the command area for the tanks, you really don't have any use for the sluices also. So for the last 30 years or so, in all of our tanks in the main city area, our sluices have been completely sealed and become dysfunctional. And this is where our problem now lies. You have the nalas, which are supposed to connect live tanks by transporting excess water from one tank to the next. You have the canals that are supposed to bring fresh water, clean water into the tanks and support fish, and you have the Kattamaisamma and the Peer in the Dargah, who is supposed to look after all of these operations. Everything becomes completely meaningless in the new urban context. This loss of their function, this loss of their meaning in the new urban context, is where our problem with our water bodies actually lies. It's in this context that it becomes possible for people to imagine tanks as lakes. So imagine now What comes to your mind when you think about a lake? Most of the time when people say a lake, they imagine some kind of boating, some kind of a promenade on which people can go for walks and jogs and so on. They imagine lawns, they imagine parks, they imagine swings, they imagine boats, maybe they imagine restaurants. They can't imagine anything like an agricultural operation. They can't imagine anything like active fishing. They can't imagine anything like washing clothes. And if we have lost all of this, I can give you very stark examples. Take a tank like Barlakunta. Barlakunta in Telugu literally means the pond in which you wash your buffaloes. Right? Now we can very romantically, in our new urban context, start calling it Buffalo Lake. Now this Buffalo Lake is full of sewage that is coming from your own houses. This Buffalo Lake is incapable of actually receiving any excess water or releasing any excess water. And the old buffalo presence is gone. The man who used to mind those buffaloes is gone. And you're left with a structure that comes to you from a past that you have no understanding of, and this is where we are actually struggling. So if we really need to rework our imagination, if we need to rebuild our tanks and create a much better city, what we really need to do at this point of time is to begin to tell stories about these water tanks. What did Mantral Cheruvu mean? What did Tella Cheruvu mean? What did Kamun Cheruvu mean? What did Hamid Khan Kunta mean? What did Singada Kunta mean? Right? Just as I was telling you about Hamid Khan Kunta, the Buffalo Lake, there's another lake here in Hyderabad called Singada Kunta. Now, Singadas are tanks that most people don't any longer recognize, because even as food, Singadas are not very important anymore. But Singada is basically water chestnut, and roasted water chestnuts were food that was sold on the streets of Hyderabad. And these water chestnuts always came from tanks in the city. And one of them was called Singada Kunta, and it is actually right behind the Taj Banjara Lake. And that Singada Kunta is now the site of a big slum. A lot of low-income people who cannot find housing anywhere have moved in there. And what we keep doing as an answer to all of this, instead of reinvigorating our own imaginations, we start looking for scapegoats and start accusing people of encroaching lands, without paying attention to the fact that actually the moment we started building houses in the command areas of tanks, we have actually encroached on a functioning system. Right? It is not the people who have built, poorer people who have moved in there and built their houses, or the houses who don't have any sewage facilities releasing sewage into these tanks. And we have so many tanks in Hyderabad now, which have essentially become receptacles for sewage and septage. This is what we really need to pay attention to. If we can think about how to reconstruct and rebuild the local histories of each of these tanks and create interpretation centers around them, if we can begin to talk about them and teach people to pay attention to local ecologies, I think we will at least begin to recover some of the lost heritage of Hyderabad. Thank you very much.